We'll just give people a few minutes to filter into the virtual space. I can still hear some bing bongs. So we've got some more people joining. Thanks for joining us this morning. We'll get started in a minute or so. Just a reminder to keep your microphones on mute, please. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I can see some more people still joining us. Okay, 2 minutes past, a nice even number, and I like to start on an even number. I'll start by introducing the series. Very exciting, our first seminar in the series. My name is Dr. Frances Howard, and I'm from Nottingham Trent University. And I'd like to welcome you all to the first virtual seminar in our Researching Youth series. So this really has been a collaborative endeavour between the British Educational Research Association's Special Interest Group for Youth Studies and Informal Education, of which I'm one of the co-conveners, the British Sociological Association Youth Study Group, and the Political Studies Association Young People's Politics Specialist Group. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the acronyms which are used from now on. I'll move forward on my slide. So since our call out for interest in this series back in the autumn, I've been working with a range of fantastic colleagues that I'm just going to give a shout out to now. So Ian McGimpsey from BERA, Ben Hankel, Karenza Moore and Evelyn Buck-Matthews from the BSA, as well as their two postgraduate conveners, Sophie Atherton and Yanina Suppers, and Ben Bowman from the PSA, to organise these series of online events, which really do incorporate a fantastic range of different topics and speakers with experience in research with young people. So I want to thank all that have been involved in organising this series so far, and in particular to BERA for hosting today. So today's event is going to focus on talking and listening approaches with young people. Just to flag up some of our forthcoming events, our next event next week on the 11th of May is going to focus on creative methods. We've actually got 2 sessions on creative methods. It's a very popular topic. And we hope that you're able to join us for one or more of these events in futures. So to see the whole list of the events, you can have a look at the BERA website under events. So back to our running order for today. We've got 2 speakers, Dr. Karenza Moore from Newcastle University, who's going to be talking about listening and talking to young people who use drugs. Following that, we have a presentation from Professor Alistair Ross from London Metropolitan University, who's going to cover deliberative discussions as a listening strategy. And the nature of these seminars is fairly informal, but we hope these presentations you will find thought-provoking in terms of your own research on your own processes. And following these presentations, we might have a short time for Q&A directly to the speakers. But the most important part of today is our breakout sessions, where you'll get to meet each other, to discuss your own research, to bounce ideas. And in the lead up to that, I shall be giving a list of provocations. So I'll do a short talk about my youth work approach to research and set up this list of provocations, and then together you'll have about 30 minutes in the breakout room to respond. And we hope that these discussions are an opportunity for you to connect with others, to share and to ponder your own talking and listening approaches with young people. We'll return at the end of the breakout session to share our discussions as a group, noting common threads and experiences. And at the end of today, there'll be a feedback form that will be circulated by BERA. So just a few kind of Zoom etiquette rules. I'm sure we're all used to using Zoom now. But if you have your screen in gallery mode, you can see everyone all at once. You can click on the chat so it appears at the right-hand side and the program's going to come up in the chat. And please do keep your audio muted until you're invited to speak. And if you want to ask a question, either at the Q&A or as part of your breakout rooms, feel free to raise your hands if you want to speak. So we have a hashtag for today. If you're tweeting about the event, hashtag BERA Youth Studies. And obviously, if you're associated with either BSA, PSA or BERA, please do use those hashtags as well. So I think that was all my notices just to introduce the event. And I'm going to hand over, not my screen share, to Carenza, Dr. Carenza Moore, who is our first speaker in today's session. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Frances. Thanks for a fantastic introduction. And I'm actually really excited to be the first speaker on our seminar series. I think it's it's been really good fun organising. So thank you very much. So I thought I'd start off focusing on listening and talking to young people who are often a lot of assumptions are made about this particular group of people. So I'm going to be focusing on listening and talking to young people who use drugs. So just to give you a brief outline, as Frances said, I'll probably talk for about 15 minutes and hopefully have some questions. I'm really looking forward to the breakout rooms and discuss some of these issues. So my research over the last kind of 18 years or so has focused on drug use in recreational settings. And as I'll kind of explain later, that basically it means young people's drug use, because they're the most dominant group in those particular settings. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of context of the research, I guess. And I suppose the kind of main focus of the presentation is to give you an idea, a provocation, I suppose, about how we can improve the way that we talk, or the way that we listen to young people, and the way that we kind of talk with young people about drugs. And that's something I'm kind of very passionate about. So talk a little bit in that context around drug education, although I'm not going to dwell on that particularly, but that's one of the kind of, I guess, the fields that we could think about in relation to how do we talk to young people about drugs. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the kind of global drug policy change movement, which includes work around how to listen to people who use drugs. And I guess what I'm proposing in this paper is that we extend it specifically to listening to young people who use drugs. So some of the barriers that are kind of presented to us, I guess, here, and then what can we do either in our own research, but also more generally. And I guess I should also point out that I would position myself as a kind of academic / activist. So that's and I also understand there'll be maybe some youth practitioners in the room, and obviously we all work with young people in a certain kind of way. So that's why I wanted to sort of think about what can we do in this space. So if there's any questions sort of beyond the presentation, then you're welcome to email me. And I've also got all my research is up at clubresearch.org. Okay, so very briefly, because I do always assume this, but as I should imagine it's no simple matter as to what a drug is. So we could understand drugs in many different ways. I think just zooming to the bottom there, probably the way that I'm going to frame young people's drug use and what we understand to be a drug is but basically by those adults, those in power, tend to decide what a drug is. It's obviously a very long historical process. And one of the ways that I think it helps to think about listening, talking about drugs to young people is to think that actually all drugs or all substances that we call drugs are not the same, So we do tend to have this, I know I've done it, you know, a catch-all term, and that's actually not particularly helpful sometimes, particularly given the very particular effects of certain substances, and also particularly given the very kind of specific context that they're taken by young people. So for example, the empathogen MDMA, ecstasy, which a lot of my research focuses on, used by young people, particularly in leisure settings, on an occasional basis, almost always with friends, and very rarely developing into problem use. So each substance that we might be thinking about when we're talking to young people, we should kind of, I guess, learn about the effects and the differences. There's obviously drugs kind of delineated by legal status. So when I'm talking about drugs today, I'm mostly going to be talking about illegal drugs, but really it is a catch-all term, so we can include alcohol, tobacco, illicit medications in there as well. So just to set the scene, really the focus or the context, I guess, of the presentation is on those substances that are controlled by the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, and that's kind of becomes more important when we think about the regulatory environment that young people are taking drugs in, and that kind of then encapsulates the environment that we need to talk to young people about drugs in, and that makes it quite difficult. So that environment is basically prohibition, or what's called prohibition regime, and the kind of language-based element of that is what's called the war on drugs. So the prohibition regime basically focuses on law enforcement and prevention. So it's a very kind of law and order approach to dealing with the use of psychoactive substances in society. And when I say a prohibition regime, that basically means criminal penalties for various different activities related to psychoactive substances. And again, just to kind of bring the focus back to young people, you know, as I said, most people using certain substances in recreational spaces are young people. So that's who we're talking about when we talk about who we're applying criminal penalties to. So there's a lot of problems with the prohibition regime. We've got a lot of evidence of particularly its impact on children and young people. And that impact is often, I guess, criticised because of the lack of evidence around a deterrent effect of drug law enforcement. And you know, certain law enforcement activities tend to focus on certain groups, particularly of young people. So street policing of cannabis, for example, through Drug Stop and Search, is very much focused on young people. And you know, we know that young people use these public spaces. So there's lots of racial disparities around the way that we deal with drugs in terms of things like stop and search rates, you know, the racism that's involved in that. Thanks, Rhiannon. So there is also this issue around sending messages about drugs, and you know, this is one of the problems that ends up happening because we're trying to speak to young people about drugs at the same time as they're constantly being sent messages, as the government describes it, about the kind of tough choices that they need to make. So that kind of, I guess, the environment that, as I said, we're trying to talk to young people about drugs. So actually, the kind of focus of the drug war and the war on drugs, obviously it's got various different focuses, but as it says there, much of the law enforcement activity and things like school exclusions relate to mostly possession offences for drugs. So, I mean, does this matter? You know, one of the things I always like to say is that most young people don't take drugs, but the argument I would make there is that even if young people don't take drugs, they're often affected by prohibition regime and law enforcement. So if you think about a young person going to a festival, you know, if they haven't got any drugs in their possession, that doesn't mean that they don't still have to go through the kind of security borders of a festival. So police sniffer dogs and also intimate strip searches. Okay, so it is important whether or not, you know, for all young people, but particularly those young people that do take drugs. So there's ONS data around this, that actually young people, that 16 to 24-year-old group, has got the highest rates of drug use in society. In the UK, we've got the highest rate of illegal drug use in Western Europe amongst young people. And according to NHS Digital, 1 in 10 11 to 15-year-olds report using an illegal drug in the past month, which counts as regular use. So some more stats there for you. Cannabis is the most popular drug, 1.3 million young people in the last year. And that's followed by powder cocaine, MDMA, and also, as you can see, this is related to quite a sizable group of young people that use drugs on a regular basis. So I've mentioned about the prohibition regime, and the main concern, I guess, as I said, if we're thinking about this as a context in which we have to try and listen and talk to young people about drugs, the context is criminalisation, as I've described, stigmatisation, and particularly marginalisation amongst those young people who are already marginalised. So, as I said, this is the context that we need to speak to young people about. There's an issue around language as well, and again, this comes up when we are speaking to young people about drugs. So in the research that I've done, there's often young people will draw on the language of prohibition and draw on stigmatising language, which is kind of understandable because, you know, obviously that that's the discourses that they draw on is something that are circulating in society. So you can see there some of the very offensive, I guess, language, and sometimes we kind of use this sort of language quite unreflexively. So maybe when we're talking to young people about these kind of issues, we need to think about how to use language in a way that destigmatise the activity that they might be involved in. So I kind of tend to say young people who consume drugs in recreational settings, but that's obviously a bit of a mouthful. It makes a terrible acronym. So when we talk about drug users, I mean, that's one term we can use. People who use drugs seems to foreground the kind of human, the fact that these are humans, people. And then the term young people who use drugs is something that I'd like to kind of, I guess, advocate and support. So in terms of drugs education, if we're thinking about the spaces and times that we talk to children and young people about drugs, what tends to happen, unless there's a very honest conversation, we want to talk to young people about drugs, but we do have this thing, we kind of don't really want, don't expect them to take drugs, or we criminalise them if they do. There's been some issues, for example, around resilience, which is quite interesting, and this comes up in the new drug strategy. So this Boris Johnson recently talked about how he wants resilience to be built up amongst young people so that they can understand the dangers of drugs and learn to say no. So that's a very kind of criminalising and stigmatising way of talking about the notion of resilience. And resilience has also been linked to some issues around the way that young people of racialised minorities in schools are treated as well. So we need to be very wary, I think, of this resilience argument. There is a huge literature about the efficacy of drugs education programmes. There's a lot of literature from the US, as you might imagine, but it's actually quite hard to find programmes or evaluations of programmes which talk honestly to young people about their drugs experiences and actually listen to what they say. And the typical thing is to focus on the risks and harms, whilst basically silencing. If young people want to talk about the pleasures of drugs, we do tend to either ignore them or silence them. Okay, so one of the ways that we can kind of, I guess, tackle some of these silences and start thinking about how can we talk to young people about drugs is what's happening now, I guess, around information sharing. So that's what is basically known as a public health approach, kind of public health informed harm reduction. And this kind of rests on the knowledge that some young people do take drugs, and if we are going to accept that, we have to accept that, it's reality. We need to have a kind of pragmatic approach to supporting them to take drugs in a safer manner but obviously not encourage them, and you have to be very careful about that. There's another kind of strand to this, I guess, which particularly interests me. So that strand rests on the idea of inclusion of young people's voices in drug debates and particularly drug policy development. And this is something that's only very, very gradually and slowly emerging now. And that sort of differs to the information sharing harm reduction approach to a certain extent, because it's about the kind of inclusion of young people in a sort of democratic policy making process. So thinking a bit more about policy and listening and talking to young people in a way, giving them the spaces and the times to be able to be involved in thinking about drug policy, in being able to contribute to drug policy change as well. So more generally, there's been this kind of movement around including people who use drugs in at least research on policy debates. Whether or not the people who use drugs are actually included in policy making processes is a difficult thing. There is some representation, various different networks of people who use drugs. There's also local networks, and there's also some networks for specific groups of drug users. So there's kind of a hope there, I guess, in some kind of activism and collective, sort of collective model of engaging with these debates. So within this model, we could say that young people who use drugs are particularly affected by drug policy, as are their family and friends, as it said there. So there's been this kind of emergence of charities that support families who have lost loved ones, often young people, to drugs and drug prohibition. So I guess I'm kind of making a bit of a plea. Young people do talk about drugs. You only have to spend a little bit of time on the social media platforms that young people use to know that. I think we should very much centre the knowledge and experience that quite a lot of young people have around drugs, and this sort of is part of the idea of young people's knowledge about drugs. And if we're listening to them, they've got valuable things to say, which I'll give you some examples in a sec. And also they're very much at the front line of drug markets as well. So we need to kind of explore appropriate ways of listening, but also obviously be aware of things like safeguarding issues as well when we're speaking to young people. So I found these quotes. Rob Rouse, who is at Manchester Met, fantastic project, long-running project now, Greater Manchester Trends, Drug Trends, and it's one of the kind of only online localised surveys about young people's drug use. It gives an example, gives an opportunity for young people to talk about drugs. So these are some examples. I won't read them out because we're a bit short on time, but these are some examples of young people's experiences of using drugs during the pandemic lockdown. And as you can see here, I mean, this is really about some emerging trends. One of the emerging trends around young people's drug use that we're seeing is a slight change because of young people's drug use within the domestic space, within their houses, within their homes, within more hidden spaces of parties, for example. So there's been a shift, and it was basically young people flagging this up to us that we can find out about these emerging trends. And this relates, for example, this quote relates particularly to a substance that is under a different kind of criminal penalty. So there's some examples here, I think, of the opportunity for us to learn from young people themselves. Okay, so some barriers to overcome. Obviously, I think I've very briefly touched on some of the ethical, practical barriers there are. And these kind of barriers, I guess, are really heightened or by the prohibition context. There is a tendency towards tough on drugs language, and sometimes we use that without realising, but we have to be very careful because that tends to silence young people who use drugs. And also, that actually, particularly in academic research, illegal drugs, talking to young people in particular, it's really difficult to get ethical approval to talk to young people that are under 18. So it's seen as a very selective, high risk topic. So I suppose my last point really, one of my last points is that there is a way that we can kind of advocate, particularly in relation to drug policy, around young people in spaces that tend to be completely accessible to them. So most recently I gave some evidence to Home Affairs Select Committee about the impact of misuse of drugs on young people in the UK. You know, that's an environment that young people would never be included in, but obviously being very aware that there might be a silencing issue there as well, and you know, all these kind of issues about representing people, you know, are very concerning. So we need to be kind of reflexive about that as well. Okay, so what can we do? I suppose this is a plea for some more focus on how we can listen and talk to young people about drugs. That can be summarised, you know, the importance of that can be summarised in 3 points. So the first is prevalence, as I've outlined at the beginning. The second is prohibition as the kind of context that we're having to work in. And I guess the positive thing is to try and think about meaningful participation at all levels. And this has actually been done very recently in relation to youth justice and the youth justice system more generally as well. And then finally, there are some actually fantastic examples of kind of what I'm advocating and asking for. So this is a project at home, so this is the project People and Dance Floors. There's a really good trailer of the video that the research group have produced, and some really nice examples of young people talking about drugs, particularly in relation to dance floors. And so that, I think that kind of gives us a little bit of hope around potential incorporation of young people's voices into drug policy debates. So there's some links there and some references, and I'll pop my slides up on the Club Research website after the presentation.
Thank you, Carenza, that's great.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions just now, but Carenza will be popping into the breakout room. She'll be part of one of the breakout rooms. So if she's in your room, you'll get a chance to speak to her. And she has also shared her email address. But really interesting stuff about how policy sets up a particular language around a topic before you even go and speak to young people. So very interesting. So for the interest of time, I'm going to hand straight over to Alistair Ross, who's going to be talking about deliberative discussions. Are you okay to share your slides, Alistair?
Sure, I'm going to hand it now.
Thank you very much, Carenza, that was brilliant.
I'm trying to find my, I had it up just now and I've lost it. Sorry.
No problem. Maybe if you click the PowerPoint symbol on your computer, it might reappear. It's probably hidden behind another tab.
Yeah.
It happens all the time.
Right. Have you got it now?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay,
if
great.
You put it on
onto
slide view. So if you use the symbol in the top orange bar, it's got a arrow in it. There we go, up a bit.
there we go. Okay.
Yeah, we're seeing that quite small. I wonder if you could make that a bit bigger in your screen.
Okay, how's that?
Yeah, that looks
okay,
good.
Great. Okay, fine. Thank you very much for the introduction and for Carenza's talk. Very interesting. And I'm going to talk about particularly the methods I've been using. I'm retired. I retired early, about 12 years ago, and have done a lot of research since then on my own basis. I'm still attached on a part-time basis to London Met. My email is there, and I'm going to talk about the processes I've been using in talking about politics and political identity with young people across Europe. I'm not going to talk about that particularly very much. I'm going to talk more about the issues around research and subject communications with young people based on that, how deliberative discussion groups can generate research data, and some practical details of actually managing a deliberative discussion. All my references are going to be available on a handout later on and at the end of the slideshow. So the problem was I wanted to talk to young people about how they talked about politics, what they thought about politics, how they created an identity that was political. And there are issues around how you do that and how you get data around that. I've been interested in this since I was 10 years old. I can remember talking with friends at school about whether I could be possibly Scottish and English at the same time, or British as well, and being quite confident I knew that I had multiple identities. And I remember at the same time, and I'll date it now, 1956, age of 10, the Suez crisis emerged, and I knew there was something going on. Britain and France had illegally invaded the Suez Canal, and I asked my primary school teacher, who was a very friendly guy, about what was going on in Suez, and I can remember to this day the way his face froze at the time. He was not going to talk to me about this, and I learnt a lesson that you don't talk to teachers about politics, and I've carried that with me in my work as a teacher and my work as a researcher and in my present study. Politics are social constructions. They're jointly constructed of the world as a way that we share assumptions about reality, but meanings are developed collaboratively with others, not separately by each individual, which raises questions about what reality actually is and how people can construct the same reality in different ways. It depends on the society, the current events, the locality, the time. And when you're researching what other people think about how they construct something, we need to arrive at shared constructions, not our construction. So there are three techniques of finding out what people think about. They do things are using questionnaires, using individual interviews, and using group interviews. And I'm going to focus particularly on group interviews. Issues around talking to young people particularly, but all people in general, it's very easy to project potential categories to people, to tell them, are you this or that? And therefore you frame and limit their responses. There's also the perception that you are testing their knowledge. You're trying to trigger an assumption that there are correct answers when you ask questions. And with young people in particular, there's a problem in developing a narrative that respects the equality and their own points of view and avoids being patronizing. And there's also an assumption that there is such a thing as a public opinion that can actually be identified around about your socio-political identity. I'm going to deal with each of those very quickly. Categories of identity, for example, they're based on the assumptions that there are category types that everyone has: gender, ethnicity, nationality. But we have all of these, and we have them in various ways. They're not mutually exclusive groups that everyone recognizes and holds to be the same. And they're generally thought to be ascribed and immutable, and they're not. We change them. We change identities constantly. So, for example, with identity around a location, a nationality or whatever, states want us to have all these things that record who we are, and they all put us into little boxes: sex, age, citizenship, religion, lineage, so on. And Benedict Anderson said it's one of the functions of the state to categorize people, a classificatory grid. And body counts create types and classes, but homogeneous bodies. They flatten people out and create boundaries between these groups. So it's difficult to research what people think about these groups, or groups in general, and which groups they attach themselves to, if you project those groups to them. Secondly, it's difficult to avoid giving the impression that there are correct answers to the questions being put, particularly with young people, but also many adults. They often anticipate questions to be closed because they're used to teachers and many other adults in authority using questions to test and assess them. So they think there's a right answer somewhere that they're supposed to supply, and they're obliged to feel and give the right answer. Then there's questions about respect for young people, because adults tend to approach young people, particularly academics, with a speciality field, and all these issues here are raised about the way in which people interact with young people, particularly around politics. This is a little list I've got from Sarah Pickard about the way in which a lot of research doesn't actually respect young people and what we need to do to generate a respect and listening to them. And finally, the idea that there actually is an opinion out there that you can grasp. We want, in much social research, to get generalizable, reproducible findings. And there's an assumption that you should be able to produce a discernible view of what the opinion of young people might be. Bourdieu critically criticized the assumption that there could be a statistical summary of opinions and belief. And he argued that it was really a construction of policymakers. Any opinion, he said, assumes that everyone has an opinion, and the production of opinion is within reach of all. And he then makes a number of postulates that you'll see on the slide. I'm not going to read it out to you, that you can actually get everyone to give a consensus view, have an opinion on the issues that actually matter. And he says this is really distorting reality. Even however rigorously you do it, there is no such real thing out there as public opinion. It's a reification that is designed particularly by public opinion formers, officials, civil servants, politicians. People are put on notice to answer questions they never considered before, he says, and they're not situated in the real world. And it's the personnel politique, he calls them, who actually frame the idea of what an opinion might be. So it's an artifact, he says. This paper by Bourdieu is only in French and not easily available, and I'm going to circulate it with the references if you want to go into this any further. Okay, so deliberative discussion groups. This is evolved over the last 20 or so years, largely in Germany. Open interviews that let respondents develop a topic in their own language, in their symbolic system and their relevant framework. So we're going to get to the forms of discourse that they actually use themselves, that young people use themselves, rather than impose categories on them. So we avoid trying to give single utterances, giving words that actually are not appropriate. We learn much more if what they say is in their narrative context of their own, rather than in their own language, in their own concepts, their own words, than if we impose it upon them. Much less structured, much more open than traditional focus groups. They set the structures, they set the conversation themselves, knowledge stocks that are not located on the surface of consciousness, but are beneath the surface. So it's conjunctive knowledge, implicit knowledge, groups of individuals sharing with each other. And the sharing is important in terms of forming the group. Because these groups, I'm talking about, are deliberative, they're not debates. They're not supposed to have an agreement at the end of the day. They're talking between each other, and the conversation goes not simply from me to them, but between them. So I throw a question out, perhaps, or some statement out, and they, if it works, bat it around between them, and I simply listen and I agree with what they're saying, because I want to hear them have their views valued. And if they exchange opinions and discuss and express difference, change their views, I accept everything that they say and let it go on, because I want to hear that debate going on, how they're doing it. There's also an argument, that pedagogical argument, that they're quite useful in discussions in the classroom. So these points I'm going to raise now are based on my own experience of organising discussions with young people between 12 and 20 in terms of their identities, in terms of particular countries, of their localities, and of Europe itself. What do these concepts of the locality, country, Europe, global belonging mean to them? Do they actually talk about them? How do they talk about them? What do they do when they talk about them? So I try to provide a narrative generating stimulus to just get the discussion going. And I begin by exploring topics, accounts, language they use in their own narratives. And only later do I move on to ask more directed questions on my own agenda of themes, giving the opportunity for the group to develop the structures and words that seem relevant to them. So I wanted to uncover the range the diversity of opinion rather than arrive at a generalized summary of young people's opinions, how they form their views rather than what those views were, the processes, the resources they drew on, the interaction between them, the sequences of how ideas developed, their reflections. Philippe Brochard said in academia, universality sells better than diversity because diversity complicates things and doesn't simplify things. And therefore diversity becomes seen as noise. And the purpose of this study was to be intentionally noisy, to reflect diverse populations. So this is what I did. Free and retired, I visited all these countries and I talked to small groups of about 6 people in each group. First of all, in Eastern Europe, the new states in the European Union and the states that are going to join it in yellow, and then moving on to Western Europe in the 1915-16 period, and the EFTA countries there. So I covered all those countries, and all those little red dots are the different locations. I was quite keen not to work particularly in capital cities or large cities, so I was working in small villages sometimes, and also in very large towns and cities. And I talked to a total of about 2,000 young people in 324 groups, and I've done some more since in Eastern Europe that's come to a halt now because of the war and COVID. So I've got a corpus of about 1.25 million words of what young people talk about between themselves and with me in these groups. Strategies. This is the key. I don't introduce leading terms like nation or state, but use words like country or Cyprus on the island rather than in this country, to get them to put their own words up. And if they talk about nation and state, I'm happy to do that. And I use those words when they use it. And things like Balkan, Nordic, values, rights, let them introduce the term. I'll talk about them then and ask them to explain them, talk about them more. I open them in a very transparent, open way. I won't, if someone says they're French, I might say, why are you French? Unusual question, no clearly single correct answer. So they discuss the views of why you might be French. They talk about culture, parentage, birthplace, language, and so on, and debate them. All responses are valid. I keep nodding at them the whole time whenever they say something. I try and keep eye contact with each speaker, showing I'm following them, saying how interesting the things they're saying are, even if they're actually not very interesting, looping the conversation back to earlier comments. So if someone says something that I sound interesting, I might let it pass for the time being, but come back and say, John, you said something 10 minutes ago about this. How does that relate with what Rebecca said just now? So that they know I'm listening to them. And they feel that they have got a sense of determining the agenda. It's building respect for their views and not ever denying their views or trying to steer them very clearly away from what they want to talk about. I make no notes. If you make notes in a conversation like this, it signals that they've said something that is suddenly interesting to you, that you want to write it down. And that means they think, oh, this is what he wants to hear. So they will continue talking about that subject. And if you actually make notes or pick up a pen and scribble something down, they see that as a marker of a way that they've changed the agenda to something that is correct in terms of what you're talking about. Try and ask very few questions, giving space for disagreement, expecting them to disagree, asking to say more about something, give an example of that, or is that always the case? And not to expect everyone to respond equally or to respond to each question. It's a discussion. It's not a sequential interview where I go A to B to C to D. I'm letting them talk between themselves and encouraging them by validating them, and by doing that and asking them to comment on each other, that they should listen to each other and not listen to me. And that's something that in a school situation is not something that often happens, as much as it should happen at least. And be asking for elaborations, innovations, interviews the whole time. So practically, agreed consent, obviously essential. it's confidential. I use pseudonyms and I explain what pseudonyms mean, give examples of that. For me, a good number is 6, at least 4, no more than 8. I explain pseudonyms, as I say. I explain why I'm come to that particular country, that I will describe them perhaps by gender and age, but no more than that in the pseudonym. Working through schools and colleges is good because the members know each other. If you have a random group coming together, they need to know who each other are before they can start feeling confident. Whereas if they come from the same class in a school or the same year group in a school, there's a degree of trust already between them that you can use to then get them to argue together, discuss together. I seat them particularly in a circle so they can see each other around the table very good. I put name tags on the table large enough that I can read, so I can always address them by name, which is important. A mic, wide angle mic in the center, and I explain why I'm doing this, talk about how they can signal to me if they want to say something when someone else is talking, and how I'll cue them in about not talking over each other and so on, because I can't hear the recording and so forth. And I talk about the kind of questions I'm going to ask. I'm going to say they're not unusual questions because they're unusual because they will not have any particular kind of answer, and they can disagree. I expect they'll disagree, and if they do disagree, they should say so. Then I know what they think as well as what the other person thinks. So I'm constantly saying, if you disagree, say so. Start with an icebreaker. I say, can you talk about yourselves? Just describe who you are. And go, that's the only time I go around the table and everyone asks, everyone answers. So there's an icebreaker sense of that. They've all spoken at least once to start off with. And I accept whatever they say. And very often they will follow the first person. So I'll get 6 people telling me about the pets they've got, or about their sisters and brothers, or the fact that they're introverts or extroverts or whatever. And they will all pass around and I simply accept it and say, that's all very interesting. What else do you have in common? And from that, we get to the question of possibly saying about the country that they come from or what have you. And then they discuss that and we get into it, and I'm talking the whole time. I don't expect them to participate equally. I encourage disagreement, and that works a lot because they will do that. And I keep referring back to what they've said. I keep eye contact. I keep using their names and involving them in the fact that I'm listening to them, expecting them to talk between themselves, accepting what they say. No notes, no question in front of me. They think the agenda is essentially theirs. And I use their words, their vocabulary, not mine. And I go back to what they said earlier with a name check. So they continually reflect upon the fact that I'm listening to them and I'm just in what they say about each other. When they are confident, after about 20 or 30 minutes into an hour, I can start introducing more directive questions, some alternative lenses perhaps. Do you think older people, like parents and grandparents, think the same way that you do? And that gets a reflection on what they said before and gets more of a discussion going around that. Or do people in the countryside think the same way as people in the town like you, or vice versa? Do people in other countries perhaps feel the same way, like some of your neighbours perhaps? And I conclude by assuring them that what they've said was really interesting. It invariably was. So that's how I do it. Not all discussion groups work. Most of them do. I've done about 350 now, and I would have thought about 95% of those produce something that's interesting, but some of them don't and they flop, which is why I've done so many partly, but also by doing so many across a range of communities in each country, a range of countries, one can begin to find patterns beginning to emerge. Got enough data to do that.
Alistair, I'm just going to interject here and let you know you've got 1 minute left to share your data.
Yeah, I'm not going to share the data. This is a conversation I put in, but I'm not going to actually go through it with you. It's on that if you want it. It's there, but I don't actually get references at the end categorized like that by categories and by individual people about issues, and the Bourdieu piece on public opinion doesn't exist is actually attached to the circular that will come around from, I think, from Bera to participants today with these references. Okay, so that's me, and those are my books around this and articles around this. What I've found from that. So I try to talk about process rather than actual findings, but it's a technique that seems to work with young people in getting them to discuss between themselves what they're thinking, what they're doing, what they believe, rather than giving them more focused questions that work only for my own agenda rather than their agenda. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. Thank you, Alistair. And what a fantastic list of great strategies for open discussion. Very kind of thought-provoking for anyone who's thinking about doing a similar approach. What I'm going to do now is just talk briefly about a different approach that I've took to talking and listening with young people, and segue into our provocations and our breakout rooms, because I appreciate we've done a lot of listening today, and it'd be great to kind of do some discussion of our own research. So I'm just going to share my screen, my slides. Just put those on in full. Okay. So interviews, group interviews, are one of the most commonly used methods in qualitative research. But how important is it for the experience of an interview to be positive with a young person? How much do they feel listened to? How much can they talk about what they want to talk about outside of the confines of our research? Are they being shut down if they don't keep to topic? Do their alternative stories and narratives matter? How much do we listen to what is beyond what we want to hear or what we need for our research? Do we really listen? So today I'm going to introduce a couple of things that provoked me in my research, that inspired me in my research, this youth work approach that encompasses an ethics of care. And then I'm going to bring in finally some work by Bell Hooks as a provocation for the discussion groups alongside the presentations you've already heard. Oh, there we go. Oh, I've skipped one page too far. Let's go back. So when planning our research, we're often told to reflect on our epistemology. And actually for me, it was my axiology that was more important. So instead of how knowledge is created, how my values as a person and a youth worker influenced my research. So for me, it was very much about the emphasis on building relationships and the importance of trust, and these particular dispositions that I brought with me from my previous experience as a youth worker. How could young people trust me, as well as this use of informal conversation? So there's an excellent paper published in the British Journal, in the Birds Journal, from Gormally and Coburn that really inspired me. It's called Finding Nexus, and it talks about how youth workers already have these values and these approaches to talking and listening that puts us in a really advantageous position of strength to undertake research. So that was something that really inspired me when I first started out on my research journey, alongside Nodding's work of an ethics of care. So when we talk to people, you know, Alistair was talking about seeming really interested, even if we're not. How do we show that we care? How do we have a kind of a central relationship as part of our conversation, our discussions? For me, this was about this long-term commitment to the field that you can't have every time you interview someone or talk to someone or listen to someone, but also about an exit strategy. What happens when you're not there? You rock up one day, you have a conversation, you do a focus group, and the next day you're not there. So this ethics of care is a real kind of social justice issue that enables alternative voices to be heard. So I've been reading quite a bit of Bell Hooks recently, who sadly passed away late last year. And in a book that I was looking at called Teaching Community, A Pedagogy of Hope, there's a chapter called How Can We Serve? And this really resonated with me. This quote that I'll read out to you does talk about teaching, but actually it's about how we can serve our young people in research. So she argues that as educators, and I would class youth researchers in that same field, we have a commitment to service, whether that be to a school, to a youth setting, to a particular class, to an individual. And I think this position can be transposed to research. So she says, the teacher who can ask of students, what do you need in order to learn, or how can I serve, brings the work of educating a spirit of service that honours the students' will to learn. Committed acts of caring let all students know the purpose of education is not to dominate or to prepare them to be dominators, but rather to create conditions for freedom. Caring educators open the mind, allowing students to embrace a world of knowing that is always subject to change and challenge. So for me, I wanted to share this quote today as a bit of a provocation that as youth researchers, we have a commitment to share, to serve that young person, to serve that individual, that group of young people, with both the findings and the process of our research. So we're going to move on now into our breakout rooms, and I've drawn together 4 things for discussion. It's a chance for you to get together, to share your research, to meet each other, and we will feed back at the end what's been discussed within the particular groups. So I want you to talk about your approaches to talking and listening that you've drawn upon in your research. Thinking about Karenza's work, how do you deal with sensitive topics or potentially unsayable stories? Drawing on Alistair's work, how can group discussion challenge these assumptions and arrive at new agreements? And drawing on the work of Bell Hooks, how much do we really listen to what young people say? So we're going to be put randomly into breakout rooms. Myself, Karenza and Alistair will also be in one of the rooms, so feel free to ask any questions about our presentations. We've got about 25 minutes for discussion, and then we'll be rejoining the main room to share the main issues and themes that have come up 5 minutes before the end. So not very much time to share at the end. What I'd like to do is ask one of you to nominate as yourselves as a chair, or kind of lead the discussion within your groups, and discuss one or more or several of these questions that you might find useful today. Okay. Thank you very much. So we're going to go into our breakout room shortly. We'll give you a 5-minute warning just before we join the main room. And I hope you've enjoyed the presentations and provocations so far today. Okay. Back, everybody. It's always such a wrench from the breakout rooms, isn't it? You can see the countdown, you know you've got a minute left, and you've just familiarised yourself with people and got into a burning issue, and then you're sucked back through the vortex into the main room. Yeah, so we've got just under 10 minutes to give a bit of feedback. And I'll go first, as I was in a lovely group with Hiba, Joanne and Rebecca, who were really inspired by the presentations earlier on today. So thanks again to those speakers. But there was a really important statement or kind of question from Rebecca, and she said, well, actually, the most important answers in her research are the ones she doesn't want to hear, because then she has to work out what she's going to do about it, or it's come out of the blue, or how she's going to analyse it. And that really kind of resonated. And we also had a bit of a discussion about how much of ourselves we share. So in doing sensitive research about, I don't know, drug use, for example, in Karenza's example, do we give our own past experiences to our interviewee, or does then that make us too much about us? So that was a little synopsis from our group. I saw that we had 7 groups. Who was in group 1? Or was anyone else like to come and be a spokesperson for the group that they were in? Please do put on your mic or your camera if you'd like to, and share what was discussed, any challenges, any responses to the provocations. Anyone from group 1? No?
I'm not from group 1, but I'm happy to start.
Go on, Chloe, that'd be lovely.
I think we were in group 5. I can't remember the number.
Group 5.
That might be the issue, that I didn't really take note of that number. I just joined. So I was with a few people, Sarah, Stephanie and Rhiannon. But bless Rhiannon, the mic wasn't working. And we spoke about a few things around the time that we have with these young people. So something that I learned a lot from practice is anything that, you know, you started off by saying, oh, we've got about 3 months to get this completed, cause like disengagement pretty soon on, because they felt like it was just a means to an end. But when the end came, it was like, well, what then? What's next? There's lots of things around trust and linking in the time with that. So how do you build up trust if we're just doing interviews, like, and then how long does that take and how does that impact? And then there was some stuff about like the ethics and that, this thing around, so you're going to write up all this research and how does that help me, because I'm so far removed from that world, so why on earth would I want to engage here? And yeah, if other people want to dip into that, yeah, that's what we spoke to and just discussed. And yeah.
So that ethical issue of, if I speak to you, if I give myself, if I let you interview me, if I take part in your group discussion, how is this going to benefit me?
Yeah.
Anybody else want to chip in? Group 1, group 2?
Hi, I'm from group 2. Hello. We mentioned ethics a little bit, but we also talked about, and I need to say hi to Vicky, Anna and Zoe. We also talked about kind of the spatial and contextual and cultural aspects of how and when you ask, what you're discussing, and how certain topics are more culturally acceptable or spatially acceptable than other, and there may actually be generational shifts about what's acceptable to say or not to say or speak about. And of course that does have ethical dimensions linked to both procedural ethics in terms of your universities, but also, and I'm also thinking of safeguarding. I did research with young people under age 18 on drugs back in the day, and I'd have ethics approval. A whole different world, right? A whole different world. But more than that, we also talked about technology and about the move online and both the joys and the perils of the Zoom focus group in terms of building rapport, dynamics, drawing out reticent members. But also, does that potentially flatten? Are you just doing a discourse analysis of conversation? What are you doing? Is there stuff that's more sayable in a Zoom room that's not sayable in the real world? What about the fact you're now interviewing people sat on their bed in their bedroom and they're under 18? How are you going to manage that? Those kinds of questions, big ones. Anyway, I'm sure everyone else will jump in.
No, that's fantastic. Thanks, Ben. I just want to flag up, we have actually got a session in our seminar series coming up on online focus groups, and exactly that whole thing will be the focus of it. But yeah, no, that's a great synopsis. Thanks, Finn. Lots of interesting questions. Anybody else wanting to share? Group 3 or group 4? We've had 5, we've had 7.
We were 7, Francis. So I'll go very briefly. So our group was Chris, Elise and Jenny, and so we did talk a little bit about ethics, particularly because Elise's work is around abortion knowledge and access amongst young girls. So we kind of talked quite a bit about sensitive topics, obviously, you know, drugs, sex and rock and roll, that's all very sensitive. We then started talking quite a little bit about creative or co-creation design, and the involvement of participants, young people as participants in the production of the research. So, you know, selection of methods and all that kind of stuff, which, you know, we said actually sometimes very hard because ethics want your tools of your research up front. So that was really interesting. Jenny talked about storytelling and narratives and the kind of role of that in terms of educational attainment. So we started engaging with the concept of well-being and you know, how that might work within research. And then Chris was talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, youth workers as youth researchers, or teaching youth workers and encouraging the kind of research ethos within the youth workers as well. So we talked, you know, loads, I can't even, so much stuff we talked about, you know, loads of different really interesting things about how conversations often on residential trips come up, and, you know, can you use those as data, and should you even think of that as data? And yeah, anyway, so I literally could have talked for another hour at least, I'm sure. So yeah, that's us.
Well, it's interesting that a lot of these topics like co-production are kind of coming up a bit further on in the series. So
it's almost like we planned it.
it's almost like we planned it. So hopefully this is a space where we can meet regularly. We can talk about these different research methods that are obviously interlinking and overlapping. And I'm really encouraged by everybody's feedback today and how generative the discussions have been. Just a little note from Finn here. She's got an event happening around pedagogies of discomfort, and they're still accepting abstracts, so that's in the chat if anybody wants to follow that up. But it is 11:30 and I'm going to bring the event to a close. I know, where has the time gone? So enjoyable, hey? And thank again very much our speakers for today, Dr. Carenza Moore and Professor Alistair Ross. After the event closes, you will get an email from Vera with some evaluative feedback on, so we do appreciate that you would fill that out for us and let us know your experience of today. And thank you very much for giving up your time. I hope you found it interesting, nice to connect with fellow scholars, something a bit different from marking at least. And we hope to see you on another event, one of these youth research sessions. But take care everyone, have a lovely day. Great to meet you all.